how did you approach project managing the construction phase for your projects? Like, how did you even get over the hump? Do you have a construction background?
No, I don't, and I think a lot of project management people don't necessarily come from that world. Which, if you're listening to this and maybe you're studying civil engineering or you're an architect, like sometimes those are the best project managers because you're in the meeting where it gets really technical and you have an idea of what's being talked about. But I think what like the analogy I've heard used and I like for project management is that you're the conductor of the orchestra. You don't know how to play any of the instruments, but how they're all supposed to work together. And you're on these meetings, and maybe it starts to get into a pretty technical back and forth, maybe even a little heated between like an engineer, an architect, or a GC, and you're thinking in the back of your head, okay, how does what they're saying, how is it going to impact the budget? How is it going to impact the schedule? And you need to not be afraid to interject and say, okay, can you explain this to me like I'm five? How does this development that happened this week in like something maybe we found with like a soil test, like how is this going to impact the foundation that we're hoping to pour in 6 weeks? And what will that mean for the schedule? What might it mean for the means and methods we're going to have to use? And how might that increase the cost? What kind of change order might come out of that? And so I think it's a lot of taking really good notes and making sure that we're directing the conversation in a way that it's really clear what the implications will be for what you care about most for the project, which is in construction. It really comes down to schedule and budget.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, today, when I talk about keeping this podcast real, when I talk about bringing real people doing the work every single day, I mean, today we got Max Heninger. He's a senior project developer at Eden Housing. And a lot of people sometimes wonder, like, what do you do in development, right? That's always like this thought process. And they hear about developers and they think about these like godlike creatures doing these things and building these ginormous buildings, but no one ever talks about what it's like in a day to day. So today, I'm proud to bring on Max Heninger onto the podcast today. Max, how are you doing today, man?
And thanks for having me on. And I wish we had godlike powers as developers, but as I'm sure we'll talk about, it's a lot of figuring out what the process is and how you can make the process work for your project. But yeah, thrilled to be on.
Man, I'm super pumped for this because when you talked about all the problems that you had to overcome, sometimes people just forget development is a lot of problem solving. Take us back a little bit, Max. How did you even get into this world of development in the first place, man?
Yeah, and this is something that I hope if folks take anything from this podcast, I'm really hoping that maybe there's some 18 to 25-year-olds out there who had no idea that affordable housing development existed as a career. Because I know I didn't as an 18-year-old. I was really interested in cities and had Jane Jacobs book on my shelf and loved really interested in urban planning and took the classes I could take in undergrad on that topic. But the idea that there's this whole world out there filled with different community development actors, developers among them. No idea that it existed. It really was only until a couple of years out of school that I learned more about affordable housing and learning what are the different roles you can play within that field. And for reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about, I think development is a really exciting part of the field to be in.
Okay, so you went to college and you want to get your master's in city planning. Like during that city planning studies, you got an internship. Was that when you first learned about affordable housing development and you just started applying? Like what was going through your head
Yeah.
as you were doing your studies?
Yeah, so I had an idea going in that one of the roles that it seemed like a lot of people coming out of the city planning master's program that I went to at UC Berkeley, it seemed like a really typical role was to work in affordable housing project management. And so I had an idea going in that that might be one of the things that I might be interested in, but it was only after taking a an affordable housing finance class and really digging into the pro forma, which I think is a great exercise if you're able to do that in school, because I think people tend to have pretty visceral reactions like I love this or I don't like this. And I loved it. It's a really powerful tool that we use in development that tells you so much about the health of a project and how viable a project is. So we had this class that started, I think this was my first year in. It takes you from the beginning of a project, learning about site acquisition, site control, entitlements, and then along the way, we were modeling this hypothetical project in a pro forma, and the final assignment was to put together a memo and turn in the completed projections, which incidentally ended up later, a few years later, when I was interviewing for project manager jobs. That's exactly what we would do in the interview process. So it was a really, in hindsight, it was such a valuable class to be able to be exposed to a hypothetical project like that and use the pro forma as the kind of the main tool of analysis.
Wow. Okay, that's probably one of the best examples of where someone took something from a classroom and actually applied it to real life. I kid you not. Like, how often do we hear from people? It's like, "Oh, I learned that in like middle school, and I don't know why I ever learned that. That was not useful." Max just gave you a great example of something that he learned from his studies that was actually applicable to the real world. And I loved how you talked about the pro forma, Max, because sometimes people forget there are so many transferable skills. And sometimes folks in finance don't realize that their skills in finance, right? Being able to look at a pro forma, dive into the details, understand the assumption, and how that can translate into real estate and development specifically. Those are great and very, very transferable skills. So I'm freaking impressed that you were able to take that, what you learned, and apply that towards your interview.
Yeah, it made me really like during the interview process, like, wow, good for Berkeley. They taught us things that were useful because it's basically like a midterm or a final exam like you'd have for class. So yeah, I think that's one of those things for people who are thinking maybe going to grad school, like looking at the classes, looking at the professors. I know when I was looking at Berkeley, one thing that was really exciting was that it seemed like they had a lot of practitioners in the field as part of the faculty, and you get a lot of real world examples in the classroom exercises, and they also tend to bring in really great guest speakers who are practitioners in the industry.
Okay, so obviously we talked about the skills that you've been able to develop and how transferable they were. When you started working sort of full time in development, what was that experience like? Did you get right into nitty gritty? Was most of your focus site selection, getting entitlements, or underwriting deals, or all of the above? Tell us a little bit about the life in what your life looks like right now as
Yeah.
a senior project developer.
Yeah, like a day in the life of project management. I think the best way to answer that question is just thinking through the life cycle of a project, because what you're doing on a day-to-day basis really depends on what stage a project was in or a project is in. So I'm sure for your listeners are pretty familiar with the cycle of development. It starts with site acquisition. That's typically for us, every company will do it a little differently, but that's when the project managers will start working on it, usually from the point that we get site control. And from there, it's you're working on the entitlements, maybe going out, meeting city council members, meeting with the city planners, figuring out what type of project will be the most viable. And we're often, and this is especially now the case in California, but increasingly in other states too, we're thinking about what are the state laws that we have that we can apply that will, as much as possible, roll out a red carpet for this project so that it can go as quickly as possible. I think that's one of the most notable policy responses we've seen with the affordable housing crisis. States are increasingly trying to find ways to cut through the entitlements process so that you don't have these kind of NIMBY horror stories where a project limps along for years. So that's the first the first part of it. You're getting entitled. And this is maybe where the process diverges the most from the market rate side of things. In affordable housing, we're not going to be able to just have a couple sources of financing. The backbone of what we do is financed with the low income housing tax credit. That might make up a little bit less than half of the capital stack for a project, but then you need to get you'll also have a bank loan, but it's affordable housing. The rents are really low, so that loan is pretty small, and you're filling that gap with local, maybe city, county, often state funding. And so you'll end up having sometimes these deals, no joke, will end up with like eight or more sources of funding. And that can really be the part of the process that takes a long time. Like going out, applying for all of these different sources, maybe it takes years, and maybe one of your sources is not so happy that they made this award a few years ago, and the county commissioners are wondering, well, when is this going to result in affordable housing? So sometimes there's some going back and saying, no, 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 we're really close, we're almost there. Yeah, so I think that's especially in higher cost states like California, where you need all of these different sources to build because the costs are really high. That part of the process can take a long time, and then the final part of that process will be getting your tax credit award. A lot of organizations, including mine, we're set up as nonprofits. We don't need the tax exemption. We'll go out, we'll sell the tax credits to an investor, and the investor will provide equity in the project that they are largely using for to get a write-off on their taxes and often to their banks. And so they're getting credit with something called the Community Reinvestment Act. And so they'll have more favorable pricing than just a random corporation would. So that's the second piece of it. You're getting your financing. And then the really fun part, you get into construction, and then this thing that's only lived on a piece of paper or an Excel sheet for years, all of a sudden is this real breathing thing that exists out in a world and in the world, and you're on site, say every other week, and seeing the foundation poured, the framing going up, and then in maybe a little over a year, it's a completed project. And then you get what's the best day, I think, in what we get to do, which is when the project opens up and you have the grand opening ceremony, which is a big celebration with all of the funders and supporters of the project, and the first residents move in, and the last speaker, after all the elected officials and other supporters go, is a resident who's going to live at this project. And without exaggeration, their speech is usually telling you about how their life is forever changed for the better. So for all of those difficult points along the way where it takes too long and you probably sent way too many emails, like that moment is totally what makes it worth it for a lot of us.
Wow. Talk about pulling back the curtain on this thing. That is incredible. I mean, a stage could definitely not fit the amount of work that you had to do to go through that. But let me kind of break it down, everything that you talked about, right? In the beginning, you talked about, okay, from the point of site control, where you have control of the site to get the project entitled, which for simple layman terms is getting your project approved, right? You mentioned that as a project manager, you're going out there and you're meeting with the city planner or city council, whoever the decision makers might be, and getting community feedback. Tell us a little bit about that process. Like, what kind of problems can people expect to face during that phase of the project, and how do you overcome those issues?
Yeah. I think a big one is honestly parking. How much of development comes back to parking? People want to know, like, how are the folks who are going to live here? Where are they going to park? That's often the way I think a lot of people think about how is this project going to interact with my life. But yeah, I think it's starting really early, and it's thinking about in this community who are our natural base of supporters that would be inclined to favor a project like this. So maybe you're looking for pro-housing groups. If it's oftentimes we know based on our funding sources or the funding sources we anticipate targeting what the population is going to be that's going to live there. Maybe it's like a project I worked on in Watsonville. Maybe it's going to be farm worker housing. So maybe you want to go out and talk to the Farm Bureau. Maybe it's going to be housing for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And there's a lot of service organizations that serve that population. So you want to make sure that they're going to be there too. And then I think it's thinking, okay, even if I have this streamlining state law that is going to, in some cases, like give the policymakers no choice but to say yes, there's a good community minded way that you can go through a project, which you should, given that as a project developer, you want the city to be on the side of the project. And there's a way that you might be kind of arrogant and say, well, we can just do whatever we want. And we're always trying to think about Eden. We've been around for 55 plus years. We're thinking about these long-term partnerships we've got with cities and counties, and we're always thinking, okay, even if the state law streamlining allows for this process, how do we still approach it like we want to be a partner with the community and not just say like it's our way or the highway. We're coming in here and we're going to do what we want.
Man, that's such a great lesson in of itself, to be inclusive, really, right? Listen, everybody just wants to be understood. If you can just try to understand, why does this person want this thing to be part of the community, Maybe it's a dog park. Maybe it's a children's playground. I don't know what that is, but everyone has their rationale for what they want to see in the community. You might not be able to make everybody happy, but
Yep.
you can at least listen to them and not trying to shove a project down their throat, which no one ever likes being on the receiving end of that. So I
Yeah.
loved how you talked about that.
And knowing it kind of comes back to the pro forma too. Like, what can I say yes to? What can I say yes to? Luckily, we're able to kind of anticipate what some of those are going to be. So, as the project manager, you're not like standing at the dais and shooting from the hip, and someone asks for like, let's build like this major community amenity that's going to add 5 million to the project, and you say, sure, no problem. You have to be really thoughtful and ideally ahead of time. Like this is what the project can support, and this is what it can. And I think there's a way too that you can communicate that in a way that it's respectful and accessible to people, because ultimately something that isn't financeable, isn't feasible, and is only going to exist on a piece of paper, like that doesn't do anything for the community. So how can you work together to find the art of the possible?
Man, and it comes back down to I love how you talked about, oh, that amenity is going to cost 5 million. I mean, you just talked about parking. I mean, if you go 3 levels of subterranean parking, there's a
Yep.
whole different set of structural considerations that you got to put in place. The water pumps you got to have in place to keep the water out when you go that deep. I mean, there's a lot of different things that people might think, oh, that's just parking. You take it as a gimmick, but that's not necessarily true, because if the rents don't support the debt service on the underlying property, I mean, then there is no project, right? A lender doesn't want to lose money, and you don't want the developer to go bankrupt either, because then that's a terrible experience for everybody. So I loved how you talked about getting all those community considerations in place, and then you talked about financing, which is great, because then you had to get buy-in from the city, because there might be secondary sources that they have to probably allocate to help you cover the gap. But you talked about LIHTC, low income housing tax credits. Man, can you just explain in a very simple way
Yeah.
what low income housing tax credit even means? It's such like a big buzzword
Yeah.
sometimes for people.
Yeah. So this is the cornerstone of a lot of affordable housing development in America. It's existed since, gosh, I think the tax reforms of 1986, 1987. And I think every year, the federal government will give each state an allocation of tax credits, and then the states create something called a qualified allocation plan, and they basically create these competitions for tax credits that affordable housing developers will go out and try to get. In places like California that have had this affordable housing crisis for decades, it's incredibly competitive to get these tax credits. Kind of two different flavors: 9% credits and 4% credits. Sometimes 9% credits are called competitive tax credits, but sometimes in a lot of these examples will be pretty California specific, but I think it's starting to come up in other places too. Competitive is a bit of a misnomer, because the 4% tax credits are tied to a bond allocation, which is now competitive in California. So no matter what flavor you're applying for, it's going to be competitive to get it. So I think we talked about this earlier. Especially if you're, a nonprofit applying for these tax credits, you don't need the tax exemption. You're a nonprofit. You don't pay taxes, but you can go out and sell it to an investor that does have a high tax bill and could benefit from the credits, or the Community Reinvestment Act points, which are this is a federal statute that requires banks to lend in all different parts of the country where they do business. And the way that they often like to fulfill that requirement is by investing in affordable housing projects. That's kind of the process.
And when you win the 9% tax credits, how much of the capital stack or the total funding that's needed does that 9% tax credit award typically provide a developer?
I think it depends on the state. In higher cost states like California, it's can be under 50%. Back when it cost a lot less to build, it would be a much bigger part of your capital
Wow.
stack. And so you wouldn't have to go out and find so many credits. But in lower cost parts of the country, it can be all or most of the
Wow.
award along with the mortgage.
Got
Yeah.
it. So 4% is even less than that then. Are they like 20% of the capital stack, 25%? What does that yield you in
Yeah.
California?
Yeah, it would be even less in that case. It tends to be for 4%, that those tends to be bigger projects, because 9% credits are I think it's 2.5 million annually a year is the cap. So
Mhm.
if you have a project that's going to be over 100 units, typically we see those projects proceeding only as 4%. So yeah, they're tough. They're tough deals to get done because you've got to go out and find all these other sources.
And how about the bond allocation that you were talking about? What does that mean when attached to the 4% tax credits? How should people
Yeah,
think about that bond allocation? Like, what does that mean? How does that fund the development?
yeah. The bond allocation is it's like you said, it's tied together. These are we'll end up applying to a state agency that determines what's called a bond cap for the entire state. And I think the type of the bond world that we're in is called private activity bonds. And so that's everything from affordable housing to high-speed rail. I think even like NFL stadiums are in that. And so within that world of, I guess what's common is that a lot of them are public-private partnerships. Within that world, like only a certain amount is available to be set aside for affordable housing. In most states, this isn't even a problem because they're nowhere even close to their bond cap. But a few years ago, California reached its maximum bond cap, and as a result, they had to start making the bond allocation competitive. And so as a result, the 4% credits, which is really what you want. I mean, we do end up getting some your bond, like bond. Why does this play into it? It's a tax exempt bond, kind of like a municipal bond, like the city of San Francisco or the state of California might issue with tax exempt interest. And that's awesome. But definitely, it saves maybe 100 basis points, maybe 75 basis points on a loan. But it's really like what we really need is the tax credits. And by the nature of them being tied to this bond allocation, that ends up being the thing that can be really hard to get.
Yeah, this is so good. And I want people to really understand, right? I mean, when you have a LIHTC deal and you're selling those tax credits, that becomes your equity as part of the deal, but you still need a debt piece, right?
Yes,
And most lenders, they don't want to finance 100% of your project because that puts a lender in a very precarious situation. So even though you're selling these tax credits, like let's say I'm going to get a tax return for $100 next year, or I could say, hey Max, I'm gonna get a tax return for $100 next year. Why don't you take my right to the $100 and give me $85 for it today, so I can take that $85 and go build the apartment building? That's how I
right.
try to simplify it for myself, and it leads to a different mechanism to fund all these affordable housing projects because it's very hard to raise capital sometimes for affordable housing. Okay, so I loved all this primary piece of LIHTC that you talked about. How about these secondary sources that you talked about? You talked about how some of them you had to get like 8 different secondary sources
Yeah,
to fill that gap. I mean, give us some examples of what those
yeah.
secondary sources look like.
Yeah, so typically they're structured as loans, but they're often called soft debt because they're a little bit more forgiving than the type of loan that you would maybe get for your house, or if you're a developer that you would get for a project. They're paid, a principal and interest are paid through something called residual receipts, which is kind of like pay us if you have it. We're not going to foreclose on the property if the cash flow isn't great one year and you're not able to meet as much as was in the projections. So you'll end up having, let's take a hypothetical example of, say, a project that has state, city, and county funding it all with different amounts of soft debt. And let's say the state award, or why don't we say that the county award was the most? And so let's say the county negotiates as part of the loan closing process when the documents are being drafted. Let's say that they take 50% of your residual cash flow, and then 25% goes to the city, and then 25% goes to the state. Every year, when you're putting together your audits, you'll look at what's the free cash flow at the bottom of of your cash flow tab in your pro forma, and I guess now that this example, like we're actually in operation, so it's like what was the actual free cash flow once the property was stabilized, and then let's say it's $10,000. 5,000 would go to the county, and then 2,500 each to the state and the city but that amount will fluctuate each year based on the amount that is based on the amount that's thrown off by the project. So sometimes it works out great for the cities and counties. They're able to actually get some cash flow back each year. But increasingly, a lot of the things that we see in just the real estate industry writ large also impact affordable housing. Insurance premiums are increasing by like double digits each year. That really impacts the cash flow. Inflation post-COVID means that everything from maintenance to like trash pickup, all of that eats up more of the cash flow that's available to go pay back those sources. And if they had like a hard requirement, it would mean that a lot of properties would be at risk of default, or they just wouldn't be able to underwrite anywhere close to as much debt as they would need to make it all work.
Wow. So, I mean, I loved how you covered the repayment terms of the secondary sources because I don't think a lot of people knew about soft debt, right? Because
Yeah.
pay as only if you have it. I mean, that in itself is a subsidy, right? And
Oh, definitely.
you as a project manager, are you researching all these secondary sources and you're the one filling them out? Is that your role as the senior project developer? Am I understanding that
Oh
correctly?
yeah, that's a big part of what you're doing in the life cycle of a project. Maybe you're subscribing to all of the alerts from the cities and counties that are relevant to the projects that you're working on. You're looking for something usually called a notice of funding availability or a NOFA, and you're waiting for that to come out. There'll be usually a deadline associated with it, and you're putting together this funding application, which will have a narrative piece. Maybe you've got some drawings from the architect, some renderings, and then you probably have some type of pro forma that you submit with that also. And it's basically making the case to the funder. If you award me this 2 million, 5 million, $8 million, whatever it is, that this project is going to be viable. And maybe they have some scoring criteria. That's also a lot often how they do it, especially if it's pretty competitive. So you're okay, I'm half a mile away from a bus station that has 5 visits during rush hour. Okay, that gets me 6 points. So you're filling it out that way. And ideally, you might have an idea even before you do this application, roughly what do I need to be competitive? And so you should have an idea going in, like, is this a Hail Mary, or do I have a good shot at funding?
Wow, because I mean, you have to determine for yourself whether or not the time investment is worth it for you
Totally.
as a project manager. Because hey, if this project, how would you look at the project? Would you look at the NOFA first and say, hey, here's my criteria, here's where the points, and knowing in the back of your head what your project looks like, then decide whether or not you want to apply for it, right?
Oh, definitely. And you might
Okay.
even be thinking like organization wide. Like, for example, California has something called the supernova, which is,
Ooh.
yeah, I know it sounds so exciting. It's yeah, I've heard it called the affordable housing Hunger Games because it's so competitive, and you can only, I think there may be a limit on the number of projects that can go in for each developer. So sometimes like organizations will have everyone who has a live project that's trying to get funding do a little self score and then say, okay, let's say we have 20 projects, these five are going to be the most competitive. We're going to limit the ones that go in to just those five, so that we're not doing a bunch of work for something that isn't going to be realistic, because that's a big that's definitely something that development shops need to think about, like your people's time, like how can we put our project managers on the smartest, most realistic things possible.
Wow. And man, is it so I'm sure when these NOFAs come out, they all have their own sort of requirements. Is that fair to say, or do you see some similarities across all the NOFAs?
I think there's some similarities. Like they typically are interested in making sure that the project is being built in a neighborhood that's going to be like a nice neighborhood for residential. At the state level for the tax credits, it's called amenity scoring. So maybe it's three, and it's also depending on what type of project you're building. So let's say it's a large family project that's designed for families. Okay, so you're going to get 3 points for being half a mile from an elementary school, or you're going to get 5 points for being less than a mile from a grocery store over 25,000 square feet that has like a meat counter. Like literally, it comes down to that. Like on the application, you might be like on Google Earth, like showing that here's 25,000 square feet, and like, oh, here's this great picture from Yelp that shows that it has like a full service meat counter at this lovely Safeway that can qualify for the 5 points. So that's a big part of it. Like even at city or county level, that they might want to see that it's going to be close to the types of amenities that people would want to be close to. Some of it is how many other sources you've leveraged, especially once you get up to like the state like tax credit level for the 9% awards. It all will come down to what's called a tiebreaker. Basically, everybody has a perfect score, but it's not really a perfect score because your tiebreaker is going to determine whether a project is funded or not. And a big part of the math of how that tiebreaker works is how much other additional funding you've got. So sometimes you might have a project that goes in like several times for tax credits, doesn't get funded, and you're thinking, all right, well, what can I do to be more competitive? Well, maybe I can work with my architect, or if I have a GC on board for pre-con, maybe I can do some value engineering, or maybe I can go back to the city and say, hey, we heard through the grapevine that you've got some additional funding. We've tried 3 times and we're not competitive. We would be more competitive if we could get an additional award. And look how close we are. We're at like step 10 of, or not 9 of 10. Can you help us get over the finish line?
Okay, so in that scenario, the tiebreaker is whether or not the state wants to see, hey, what's the city or the county doing on their end to contribute
Yep.
to it, so that the state doesn't have to use all the resources for your project. That's a pretty
Yeah.
good way to
Yeah,
say it,
and
right?
I think all funders kind of have that mentality. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're a county commissioner or a city councilor, like what you'd love to be able to say to say to your constituents is, look at all of these wonderful additional sources that we've leveraged. We've taken $10 million from the city and we've gotten another 100 million in outside investment, which very understandable. Like they need to justify to their constituents why this tax or why this bond was a good investment. But it does mean that if everyone is trying to leverage a different additional sources and you're getting lots of really small loans, like what that policy environment creates on the ground is a lot of developers spending years filling out funding applications, and it all you've got an interest rate clock. It all adds up.
Man, and I love how real you kept it today, Max. Because man, what's like the hardest part of this step? Because I remember when I used to be a project manager, Max,
Yeah,
it took so much energy and effort just to try to coordinate everybody's calendars to
yeah,
jump on a call and say, hey, can I, Mr. City, can I get some help? Or Miss
yeah,
County, can I get some help? And that's in of itself so much work. And maybe you had to go to architect or the GC that you talked about to do some value engineering. It's like trying to find everybody in the right parties to get on a call. Sometimes people just underestimate how much work just that in of itself is. So
yeah,
tell
yeah.
man, tell us about that. What are the hardest parts of that piece?
Yeah, like one of the hardest weeks of the closing is just like scheduling the closing call that has to have 30 people, and then the one person responds on the doodle poll. They're only available like two of the 30 slots you gave them. Like, oh, you're very important. So I think everyone's trying to do their best. We're all kind of working within the system that we've created where, I mean, like really, really zooming out, like the federal government stopped building public housing with Richard Nixon in 1972. And we have this tax credit that was created in the 80s, but that's not enough to fund everything. And so it requires like states and cities and counties to all create their own sources of funding to help projects get over the finish line. So I think everybody's got good intentions. Like everyone's trying to step up to solve the housing crisis, but it does create a challenge when it's just so diffuse, all of the different sources of money.
Well, I know that the listeners today are going to listen to this podcast and they're going to be able to regurgitate all the stuff we talked about financing, because now if they were to ever pursue a career like Max and what you're doing every day, now they can come in with a realistic expectation. Like, hey, I'm not going in there and breaking ground on the first day as a developer. There's so much
Yeah,
work to do. And now that we talked about the financing, let's talk a little bit about construction, because I think there's
yeah,
a lot of fear around construction, especially for folks that are look, I'll be honest, I'm very finance oriented. I like being in the pro formas and
Yeah.
managing a project, but I know nothing about construction, to be honest with you, Max. So, how did you approach project managing the construction phase for your projects? Like, how did you even get over the hump? Because
Yeah.
are you do you have a construction background?
No, I don't, and I think a lot of project management people don't necessarily come from that world. Which if you're listening to this and maybe you're studying civil engineering or you're an architect, like sometimes those are the best project managers because you're in the meeting where it gets really technical and you have an idea of what's being talked about. But I think what like the analogy I've heard used and I like for project management is that you're the conductor of the orchestra. You don't know how to play any of the instruments, but how they're all supposed to work together. And you're on these meetings, and maybe it starts to get into a pretty technical back and forth, maybe even a little heated between like a an engineer, an architect, or a GC, and you're thinking in the back of your head, okay, how does what they're saying, how is it going to impact the budget? How is it going to impact the schedule? And you need to not be afraid to interject and say, okay, like, can you explain this to me like I'm five? Like, how does this development that happened this week in the like something maybe we found with like a soil test, like how is this going to impact the foundation that we're hoping to pour in 6 weeks, and what will that mean for the schedule? What might it mean for the means and methods we're going to have to use, and how might that increase the cost? What kind of change order might come out of that? And so I think it's a lot of taking really good notes and making sure that we're we're directing the conversation in a way that it's really clear what the implications will be for what you care about most for the project, which is in construction. It really comes down to schedule and budget.
That is one of the best explanations I ever heard about Project G Max. Because man, I'm serious, man. Because a lot of people sometimes they mumble and jumble and combine everything, and it all becomes confusing. But I loved how you broke down the framework for the questions that you want to ask. Is even when the conversation gets so technical, even if you don't know how deep the foundation needs to go, you could be
Yeah,
like, "Hey, what happens to the sequence of events? If the concrete that needs to be poured on this site in 6 weeks from now needs to be delayed another week, I need to communicate that now to that subcontractor that's supposed to be
right.
there on that day." And that's such a great way to just approach the problem, because if you can just figure out, hey, this is cost me more money, and what happens to the schedule, that is such a great way to approach any conversation as a project manager, even if you have no idea all the technical stuff they might be talking about. That's so good, man. So good.
And even if I think it's kind of embracing like, okay, like maybe what's being talked about today, like I'm the dumbest person in the room, but I know things that these other folks don't know about like what a delay of 2 weeks in April might mean for the project. I know what the bank has been asking about, like, I really hope this gets worked out by the next funding draw. Like I'm getting pressure from my higher ups. So only you as the project manager know the full context of what a project may be going through right now. And you're like everyone else, like sometimes the really specific like engineers, like they'll be thinking about the bigger picture, but ultimately like that's what you bring to the meeting as the project manager. So it's important, especially when you're new and you didn't go to school for an engineering or design, and so it can be a little intimidating. It's all about like not being shy, speaking up, and making sure that you're being the voice for what holistically does the project need.
Well, if that doesn't inspire someone that's listening today to take a chance on his career, because Max just told you how to overcome all these thoughts that or limiting beliefs about yourself, that you can't do this affordable housing development gig as nothing about construction. I think Max just really helped you get over that hump. And I mean, Max, during the construction phase, like what else are you responsible for? Are you do you have to track like where all the funding goes, and like especially when you have 8 secondary sources, like what funding is
Yeah.
allocated where? Well, is that the fun part about your
Yeah,
job too?
yeah, fun. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a part of the job. It's yeah, a lot of it is, and it does tend to be. I actually would use the word fun because it's the part of the project where like it's actually like physical, real things in the real world are happening on site. So that actually is pretty exciting. Every 2 weeks, usually we're out in the field with the hard hats and seeing the foundation get poured or the walls go up. But yeah, a lot of what you're doing is you're reviewing and approving change orders. You're preparing draws each month where that's what you got. We're asking about like what funding goes where. You're thinking, okay, what order are my funds going to come out? And usually what you want to do is make sure you've got your soft money, any soft money that can come in, and that's your soft money, your city, your county, your state, in all likelihood. If that can come in during construction, that's great because yes, it has an interest rate, but all of that is going to be paid through residual receipts. So it doesn't add to the total project cost the same way that your construction loan would. Like if you don't want to draw down your construction loan faster than you need to because bigger outstanding balance is going to mean more interest, of course, that you're paying throughout construction. So it's a lot of thinking, okay, I think my county loan is going to be exhausted in months 1 through 4. And then maybe I'm going to have my city loan come in once the county one is exhausted. Oh, but wait, oh yeah, the city loan had those restrictions. I can't fund like this, that, and the other thing. Okay, maybe I might need actually I should have my city loan go a little bit in front because I know I've got that expense coming up that will be eligible. So it's just kind of thinking of, all right, like how do I expend all of my soft sources sooner than later? And are there any eligibility constraints that might limit what they can be spent on? And how do I make sure that they're going to be allocated at a time when those types of expenses are coming up?
Ooh, that's so good. And you get to be in charge of that as the project manager. You understand what your cost of capital is. I love how you
Right.
talked about, hey, draw down on those soft debt first because the implications might be a little bit different versus your traditional construction debt.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important besides for all the restrictions, right? For what you can use those sorts of. I mean, this is so vital to the project. I don't want people to glance over this at all. Like you are controlling the cost of capital, and that dramatic could mean thousands, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars if you do it correctly and keep your overall
Yeah.
cost of capital down.
It's one of the levers you have as the project manager to keep it from being more expensive than it needs to be.
All right, Max. So you have just shined a bright light on this profession. And I have to ask you, what do you wish you should have known when you first got into this affordable housing development space? Like, what would be advice that you would tell yourself when you just started your career in affordable housing development?
That's a good question. I think the it depends on what your background was. Like I felt like on the financing side, like going from like grad school project pro formas to the actual pro forma, like definitely that, there's a jump there, but it's still kind of the same language. It like managing like the the trades during construction like that's not something that, or it's a lot harder to replicate that in a classroom environment, especially like, okay, let's kind of stay within the example of construction. You get a change order for $20,000, and okay, like, do you agree to it, do you not agree to it, how do you approach negotiating it? Like maybe you took a class at the business school about like negotiation and you're trying to remember what they told you there. But I guess knowing what I know now, like it does feel like I think you were saying earlier, like is it actually like that simple? Like schedule and budget, like that, those are two really good guiding principles for pretty much every decision. So okay, maybe the GC can push back on their subcontractor that's asking for this, but okay, how many weeks is that going to take? And are they not going to perform other things that need to happen on site until it gets worked out? Or is it ultimately going to, if you're we hold the line as the developer and we say no, is it ultimately going to come out of a GC contingency that you would otherwise get back at the end of the project? So I think it's thinking like, okay, like when are the times that you don't say yes, and one of the times, and especially when it's related to schedule, that actually that this is, maybe you don't agree with everything that they're claiming, but the cost of delay is more than the cost of the change order.
I love that. The cost of delay might be greater than change order. Sometimes folks, subcontractors, they might take it personal, right? If you don't pay them, or
Yeah.
you might think they're trying to get one over you. And you have to weigh whether or not, hey, if I push this out a whole week, that might push that out a whole week. And all of a sudden now that other person that you pushed down or you pushed down 2 weeks isn't going to be available anymore because they had to get
Yeah.
another job, right? And
Yeah, that
that's
happens.
oh, that is so. I just cringe sometimes when you think about the massive amount of sequencing. That's what
Yeah.
sequencing that needs to take place for you to think about all the way downstream about what's going to happen, who this decision is going to affect. And thank you
I
for
mean,
sharing
just
that.
like alone and sometimes I think it's helpful when you're emailing people, like they've all heard developers say time is money and like, okay, like whatever, there they go again. But like when you get, if you think about it, like what does an extra month cost? Like just in construction loan interest, when that construction loan is like fully drawn out, like that can be $175,000. So like I would, if you're trying to like negotiate with someone on the timing, like this is going to cost us a month, which in interest alone, not even including like what you're going to be paying the GC to keep the trailer on site. Or we didn't get into this, but tax credits have penalties if you miss deadlines. So maybe you've got the equity payment is going to have an adjuster. It's going to be smaller than it was going to be otherwise. Like not even like getting into that math, like just the interest alone. Here's what it's going to cost, and I think that can be helpful for making it real. Like, oh, okay, like this is why I should actually prioritize like whatever it is you're telling me is important.
Man, that's such great advice, man. You probably just saved someone like a year's worth of heartburn easily by sharing everything that. And man, this is a question I ask everybody on the podcast, Max, and love to hear your perspective and just see where the conversation goes afterwards. But I love to hear from you. Why do you think affordable housing, particularly the lack of supply of affordable housing, is just so hard to solve for?
Yeah, I think I mean I think a big challenge is what we were talking about earlier with how diffuse the sources of funding are. You're spending a lot of time putting together funding applications versus I think if you look internationally, it tends to be more like a single source of funding, and so there's a lot less time between getting the approvals and then starting construction. It's really expensive to build, especially in California, and it's a problem that compounds on itself. Like if you're trying to build a high rise in San Francisco, market rate or affordable, the very fact that San Francisco has become so unaffordable makes it more expensive because your labor pool literally like will be people in the Central Valley of California who are getting up at 4 in the morning to drive out over the Bay Bridge into the city, and what that person is going to require for that job to be worth it versus a job that they're able to drive 20 minutes to, like that also increases the cost. Which, yeah, that's kind of, it's like you can see like how a problem compounds on itself. So yeah, it's something that I think we need to be thoughtful about in the field, especially in the market rate world when things become too expensive, like projects just don't pencil and they don't happen. And in the affordable world, like, well, you can get more public money to fill a gap. But we saw last year a really critical regional housing bond in the Bay Area was not able to make the ballot for multiple reasons. There was a lawsuit, but I think part of it was that the polling wasn't particularly great. And I think we always need to be thinking, even among populations and regions where the public is pretty supportive of creating affordable housing, I think we always need to be thinking, how are we stretching each dollar the furthest? How are we bringing the cost per unit down, or at least like keeping it from rising more than the rate of inflation? Because we can't just take it for granted that the public is going to always be there to support bond after bond if they look out their window and they don't see the housing crisis getting any better.
Wow. And what are you seeing for like construction cost per unit now? I've heard of like 500,000, 600,000. What are you seeing nowadays in your career?
I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say in California it's over 1 million in some
What?
cases. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. It depends on the type of construction, but yeah, that's very real. So there's a big push within the industry. Like, what can we do on the construction side to bring that cost per down that cost per unit down? I think construction is like the one field where like every most other parts of the economy have just had these major gains in efficiency over the last 50 years, but construction is not one of them. Like you don't if you're trying to build a car, it's not like you've got like it's assembled in your garage with like each trade like coming to do their piece of it, and then at the end of the day, you've got a car in your garage. But that's kind of how we build housing. So modular construction gets a lot of attention. I think it is pretty exciting. You look internationally, and that's much more of the norm. There are some challenges with that, so it hasn't completely taken over the industry. But before we hopped on, I looked at one project that we recently completed in Vallejo with modular construction, and that ended up below $700,000 per unit, which in the context
Oh,
of California, where it's not uncommon to see $1 million per unit projects, pretty good. We're
well,
also,
educate us a little bit about modular. What does
yeah,
modular mean for folks that don't understand what does modular
yeah,
construction mean?
yeah. So it can mean different things, but I think when people say modular, what they're often referring to is a type of project where you've got the trades on site, pour a foundation, and maybe if it's like a concrete podium style of construction where you've got like the first floor will be concrete, like that'll all happen on site like any other project. But then when it comes to building floors, say like 2 through 4, that's going to be modular. So you've got a crane that will lower in units. They get stacked like Lego bricks, and these units they're getting built off site in a factory and bringing together all of the efficiencies that come with building something in a controlled indoor space versus building it out in the field where things are imperfect and when weather is a factor. So it's the type of thing that I hope we're able to see more utilization of it in the future, especially with robotics and AI. You could imagine that there could be a lot of savings there, but there are some challenges. Like it's everything is so crucial around like the timing of when the factory will complete what they're going to do. So it just adds a lot of pressure on like the units being done on the day that they're supposed to be done. And maybe the factory's like backed up from another job and they're behind schedule. So it does, as a developer, especially with most of these factories are startups, like, and there's a lot of modular startups have gone under. So you're taking on a lot of counterparty risk at this point versus where it would be nice to 15 years down the road. This is a mature industry. There's a lot of companies with that have been doing this for a long time now, and maybe they've got the robotics angle of it really dialed in. Maybe then the risk profile to going modular decreases quite a bit. So, and then
Oh, so
there's
I'm
also
a
the, oh, go ahead.
sorry. Sorry, I guess I
Yeah,
just want to make sure I understood the pros, right? So modular, the
yeah,
pro would be you save a lot more time because you get to bring the Lego bricks that's already
yep,
manufactured offsite, so you don't have to do as much framing on site and just
yes,
kind of stack them all together. But the
yes,
downsides, if I understood you, is like, okay, that same speed efficiency might be offset if that startup, whatever modular manufacturer, don't execute well, meaning they're backed
yes.
up from a job, and now suddenly you thought you were gonna get all this time savings actually becomes a time delay because you rely on that person to be timely. Am I did I
Right.
hear that correctly? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And then it also like, what if the factory starts going faster than you and you've got, because maybe stuff happens in construction. Like
Yeah.
you do your best to try to plan for things, but maybe there's like a gas line that you didn't know was going to be there, or
Oh.
there's some like pollutant in the soil that wasn't uncovered in a previous environmental report, and now you're delayed on site. But meanwhile, like the factory, like in order for that business to be viable, like every day things need to be churning through their assembly line. Well, they're still going to build at when they were going to do it. And maybe now you've got like units like sitting outside, like getting rained on or something, which doesn't happen when you're just building it classic stick frame. So there are some things that I think still need to be worked out across the industry there. But it's also like modular is a spectrum, right? And like maybe it isn't, you're not going to go all the way to having them come down like Lego bricks, but maybe your framing is going to be panelized construction. Like the walls are essentially built off-site. They're going to come in on a semi truck, and then instead of the construction workers like laying down each stud one by one, they're just going to like put up the entire pre-fabricated panelized wall of the building at once. So I think there are definitely ways where you can get some of the efficiencies with modular without going all the way to the building most of it offsite.
Man, this is so cool. I love talking about this stuff, man. And If you could just share, do you have time to
Yeah,
like just share one more type of innovative thing
sure.
that you're seeing in construction right now? Would love to kind of hear your thoughts on what you think might work.
Yeah, modular I think is probably like when we talk about bending the cost curve, like that's probably one of the big like moonshot plays. I think there's a couple other ones where it's you would want it to be there, but maybe not quite yet. Like one is conversion of existing buildings. We're seeing a lot of press around that, not just in the affordable world, but it's like every armchair urban planner who reads the Times of the Wall Street Journal and it's like, okay, well, look at all these vacant office buildings in downtown
I
Manhattan and San
know.
Francisco. Why don't you turn them into housing? Like, yeah, that would be awesome. But it turns out that there's a very particular type of building. You want that like 1920s Art Deco gem where the floor plans are a little bit more narrow, so you don't end up in a very sad unit that is just a very long shaft of a little bit of light at the end of a long tunnel, because that's the only way that you're able to lay out a floor plan in a 1970s, like the type of building from like Office Space where it's like a huge cubicle farm. Like that's a tough thing to convert into housing. We're doing one conversion right now in Marin County. This was through a something called Project Home Key in California, which was an initiative during COVID to try to convert existing buildings to specifically like homeless housing. Oftentimes those were acquisitions of like motels and hotels that had their business dried up during COVID. So there was a good opportunity for the state to partner with a developer to buy an asset like that and turn it into housing. I think for like a motel or a hotel, especially one that doesn't have a lot of deferred maintenance, a lot of the ones that really made sense, like that low hanging fruit was picked. So you're looking at, okay, how can I find a building that isn't going to have so much deferred maintenance or require so much in the way of moving structural support around, or like basically having to like redo the whole thing, that it ends up being just cheaper to build it from scratch. So it's one of those that like looks like sounds like an awesome idea, but maybe hasn't played out as awesome as you would hope. So I think yeah, go ahead.
Man, I'm just glad you brought that up because I've been reading about that all the time, and I'm just like, do these what it means to like cut into steel and
Yeah,
compromise the structural integrity of a
yeah,
building? All right, it's just I know it sounds simple to convert all these office buildings if you just have everybody sleep on cots or something, but
yeah,
for residential units, it's a whole different ballgame. So,
yeah,
Max, I think this was such an insightful conversation. Man. I am so grateful you came onto the podcast today, and again, man, I'm just so grateful, and I can't thank you enough, man, because without people like you, I really would not have had the home I grew up in. So for that, I'm so grateful, man. I'm so grateful you came on a podcast, and I'm so grateful you came on to inspire so many people that are going to look to you as a role model, as a profession that they can now explore for their own career paths, especially if you're out there right now and you're not that happy with your profession, whatever that may be, and maybe you're in finance, but now all of a sudden Max opened the door for you to realize that there's a whole another world for you to explore a career that lets you feel fulfilled and lets you create the impact that you want with your time and energy. I mean, Max, this has been so good. I mean, do you have any other advice or parting words for the audience today before we conclude?
yeah. I think let's see. I mean, and some of this won't be really specific for affordable housing, but I'm thinking especially to if you're really early in your career or you're still a college student, it's never easier to network with people than when you've got .edu at the end of your email address. People, I mean, no joke, people love talking to students about, and generally people like to talk about themselves. So it's not actually that much of an ask, as especially as a student, to say like, hey, can we get coffee, or can we have a phone call? Can I have 30 minutes of your time? And can you just tell me about your experience in this thing that I'm interested in doing? People are tend to be pretty receptive when they get those kinds of asks when it's coming from a student. The second thing is write an op-ed about something that you care about. This is another one where people think, how do you get something published? Like that's really hard. But one of the ways that when I was thinking about applying to grad school, I figured, all right, maybe I should try to get something published. And what wasn't as hard as I thought. I just sent something into the San Francisco Chronicle about affordable housing and a new state law, and they published it. So I
What?
think about and like it's the kind of thing that I never thought would be that easy to do, but especially if you like writing and are interested in topics that you think there would be an audience for, give it a try. And then the last thing I would say is, and this is also with an eye towards students, write your own letters of recommendation. This is another one where like people are pretty busy. You ask a professor to, can you write me a letter of recommendation? If you write them a rough draft, you're doing them a huge favor. It takes a big lift off their shoulders, and it allows you to control the narrative a little bit. So maybe they're like, all right, well, okay, this person's in the top 0.001 ever. Okay, we'll adjust that a little bit, tone it down a little bit, but by and large, they'll be appreciative. When I was like a teaching assistant in grad school, and undergrads would ask for a letter of rec, I'm like, yeah, well, you put it together. I'll make a few tweaks, but it's yeah, just it gives you a little ownership of it. So
Man,
those
this is
three things.
such good freaking tactical advice, man. I love that. I wish I had that advice when I graduated undergrad, man. Well, Max, hey, for people that want to follow you or learn more about you, where can they get in touch with you? Where would you prefer for them to follow up?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, or now X, and maybe we can drop that in the show notes. And yeah, if anyone's interested about affordable housing as a career, happy to talk to people, because it's definitely I maybe looking back, like the one thing I really wish is that I had known more about this field earlier. So maybe someone out there is listening to this podcast, or the other great people that you've had on, and thinks, what, I want to jump into this whole crazy world of building affordable housing and doing my part to make it a little bit better.
All right, guys, go easy on him, but follow him on LinkedIn.
Yeah, careful what
I'm
you
gonna
wish
link
for.
that down. Right, I'm gonna link that down in the show notes. Message him, and honestly, if you're really serious about a career path, Max has been such an amazing guy to talk to. When I first messaged him on LinkedIn, he answered my message first of all, so thank you, Max, again for doing that, because a lot of people ignore me, and Max was just so willing and open to kind of come on. And I'm so grateful to have friends like Max, to have folks like Max that are so willing to give their time to share this information with all of you that might be thinking about making an impact on affordable housing, because you don't need to be a real estate investor owning like 1,500 Section 8 single family homes to make a difference. You can have a career in affordable housing and still make a tremendous amount of impact. And Max is just a great example of that. So, Max, this has been so good, man. Thank you so much for coming on. And I can't wait to bring you back onto the podcast at some point to talk about your next project.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks so much for your time, Kent.
All right. And we are out.